So now the other component, the other side of capacity building. For the aviation expert in the room, specifically around network systems and applications, I'd like to call Mr. Chris Berger.
My name is Chris Berger. I got involved in the project specifically to help with the regulatory side of things and the legal compliance side of things. I also have a background in aviation training, and I tried to contribute a little from that point of view. I'll talk a little about the legal framework within which unmanned aircraft operations take place. The application process for a department or an entity to get permission to operate unmanned aircraft for various purposes. I'll refer a little bit to the specifics of this project, some practical issues and some future suggestions. Thank you. I doubt if I'll need it. Thank you. The legal framework is mostly within the civil aviation regulations, which are within the Civil Aviation Authority, the South African Civil Aviation Authority. The CAA operates within a guidance framework provided by the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, which is an agency of the United Nations, and which doesn't have any legal standing in a country like South Africa. All it does is to publish standards and recommended practices, which the local regulating authority then has to implement. So in our case, the CAA. There is a part of the civil aviation regulations called Part 101, which deals specifically with unmanned aircraft operations. And it was promulgated fairly recently, and South Africa was one of the first countries in the world to actually have such a framework. The idea was that it was inevitable that there was going to be a huge increase in the use of unmanned aircraft, and that we had to be ready for that. So the intention was to have a freestanding set of regulations which are not dependent on other regulations, because people participating in unmanned aircraft are typically not from the aviation industry. They're typically either within, within some application area rather than from the aviation industry itself. And we were successful in that regard, but the involvement of the Air Services Licensing Council came as a bit of a surprise. And the Air Services Licensing Council is specifically there to regulate airlines. And so initially they were going to demand a 100,000 Rand deposit before the application process could even start, and so on. And it's made it extremely difficult for small entities such as a government department or such as a small company to participate in the industry. And it's a shame, because there are certainly huge opportunities for small companies to make a big difference, were it not for the fact that it's very difficult to comply. The application process consists of drafting a manual of procedure and then submitting this to the Civil Aviation Authority for approval. And the manual of procedure includes a complete organogram with certain officials that have to fulfill certain purposes. So you have to have people that are responsible for specific aspects. But the application process takes many months, if not years. And consequently, a little business that has only 2 or 3 people can't appoint 5 people into posts and then sit and wait for 18 months before they can start earning revenue. And that's one of the challenges that we had to work around. In the end, we solved the problem in the context of this project by involving an established operator with the necessary approvals, and getting the operator to serve 2 purposes. On the one hand, providing the legal framework within which we can operate legally, or within which the department can operate legally. But secondly, also providing some, call it on-the-job training, because the transition from a freshly minted remote pilot to someone who can operate consistently and without jeopardizing safety and jeopardizing the integrity of the equipment is not a trivial process. So that has certainly been the way that we solved the problem. And to our satisfaction, I think it worked well in the end that we have an established operator, UDS, that can help the remote pilots to make the transition into operating with sufficient experience and sufficient background to stay out of trouble. I met someone who repairs unmanned aircraft for a living, and he says that his money keeps falling from the sky because organizations typically have 1 or 2 pilots trained, and then within weeks they reduce the equipment to rubble, and the insurance then sends it to him and he has to repair it. So he says his money keeps falling from the sky. We were, like most things in South Africa, victims of bad timing when the flu came, and it's been very disruptive in many respects in this project. I would also say, the Air Services Licensing Council, incidentally, during this period was disbanded and was completely dysfunctional for, I think, almost a year. It is now back in operation, but that was another reason why we had to change our plans. I want to mention something else specifically. The expectations around the project are difficult to manage and something that we will have to address in future, which I'll discuss in the next slide. But there had to be a bit of negotiation and a bit of haggling to get to the point where we could finalize certain issues. One of them is the ownership of assets. So government-funded assets being made available to a private organization to serve a government department. The ownership of the assets needed some serious thought. Also, the issue of mutual obligations, providing training to an individual or providing equipment to a company with an expectation to receive services in future, I think needs to be formalized to some extent. In other words, there needs to be some sort of an expectation from the company's point of view to be able to get enough business to invest in the project. And on the other hand, from the funders, in this case the government, there has to be an expectation that both the company and the individuals involved will stick around for a reasonable length of time. It just so happens that a well-trained remote pilot with a bit of experience, shall we say, has some options. Practical issues, I think Mr. Skosana briefly referred to red tape. Post holders must be appointed before the application. As I said, that's a very serious constraint on the ability of small organizations. Process could take a long time, and the risks associated with inexperience, I think I've covered those too. Future actions. We think that government departments, this provincial department is a case in point and was sort of an attempt to try to formulate a process for future reference. So we think that assistance from existing commercial operators is probably the only feasible way of getting things like this done in future. In other words, instead of trying to cultivate the necessary capabilities within the department from day one, there's some benefit in working with an established operator such as UDS or any of the others. We think that departments and enterprises, small enterprises, should be assisted with the application process. One way that I've advocated personally is to actually devise a manual of procedure, a sample, which an organization can adopt and simply kind of populate the framework. Obviously, someone will have to sit down and do this in cooperation with the Civil Aviation Authority. There are people who do something like that, but they charge upwards of 100,000 Rand for it, whereas I think a government department or the CSIR or some sort of an impartial entity that can produce a sample that people can simply adapt to their own requirements would be very, very beneficial in getting the industry up and running. I think pressure should be brought to bear on CAA to simplify the process. ICAO published a set of model regulations for similar operations last year, and those regulations are considerably more lenient than the regulations that we have. which leaves room for a considerable alleviation of the complexity of the application and the licensing process. I said there, as delicately as possible, the Air Services Licensing Council appears inappropriate for the scale of operations. It's an organization that's there to license airlines with huge capital expenditure and with huge implications on safety of life. It seems inappropriate for this kind of application. Mutual obligations, I think I've spoken about that enough, and there should be a policy regarding experience level, which involves in-service training and some level of supervision until eventually the capabilities can be established within the department concerned. Thanks. Any questions? Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So I would like to touch on one area that you had in your slide, the last slide, future actions. Mutual obligations should be formulated in advance. So you talked about service period in exchange of equipment. If you could just explain that to us in terms of what are the current understanding between the obligations from ZAMESA itself and the KZN government, and who is going to be responsible to fostering that obligation culminating into an agreement of some sort. I think it's an important area in terms of the terms and conditions for the transfer of the equipment or the capability to ZAMESA. If you could just clarify that for us, please.
Certainly. It's a little outside my scope of involvement. I identified that particular issue as something that needs to be formalized up front, and I think this project came against the background of a lot of unknowns, and so I don't think it was addressed early enough in the process, partially because no one knew exactly how things were going to pan out. So, Andre, what do you suggest? Can you address that question for us? As I said, to my mind, there are two issues involved. One is the relationship between the government department and the contractor, in this case ZAMESA, and on the other hand, between the contractor and the individuals involved, in this case, the remote pilots. Andre, do you have some suggestions for us?
Other than just to mention that, yes, that is something that we did come across, because typically your government department would put out a tender, and that is obviously for whoever applies to the tender. You cannot lock in a certain service provider except with a official long-term contract or agreement or partnership of some sort. So that is, I think, what we're implying here, that it is not a straightforward answer for that very fact that it must all be a free and fair tender process in all cases where a department wants work to be done. So yes, it's still some thinking around that, Chris. Thanks.
All right. So that is one of the reasons why one can't simply say, there's an unmanned aircraft for you, you're going to have business for the next 5 years. There is still the government procurement framework to work within, and it really complicates matters. Any others? Right. Seems like I'm off the hook now.
Thank you so much. We appreciate the insight. As a token of our appreciation, we'd love you to take this.
Thank you. I also have to wait for the camera now.